Good morning, everybody. Bim's just having a bit of trouble joining, so he will be with us in 1 minute. I'm sorry to keep everybody waiting. Thanks for coming to another of these briefings with Lord Deben. I am going to introduce him now. He obviously is the chair of the Committee on Climate Change. These meetings are a bit of a one-stop shop for anybody who is engaged and interested on net zero, parliamentarians, the media industry, civil society, academia as well. Polly Billington's with us as well, the director of UK 100. UK 100 is the only network of local and combined authorities that are committed to clean energy and clean air, and local governments come up a lot in these briefings in the past. So Polly's with us to do a bit of a deep dive and take a bit of a closer look. And Bim will be able to introduce Polly during the call. But for now, I would like to invite Lord Deben to give his reflections on the last few weeks and what's going well on net zero, what the government deserves credit for, and where he feels ministers' attention should be focused next. Lord Deben, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, first of all, we do have to celebrate the fact that the government is going to present to Parliament the sixth carbon budget. That is a major decision. It's absolutely essential if we are to reach net zero by 2050, which is our commitment. But one shouldn't underestimate the importance of the decision, and also of the commitment to the figures within that, both as our nationally determined contribution for 2030 and the 2035 figure as well. So I'm very pleased about that. And we should be very clear that this is a major decision and one which we should be very supportive of. And I'm very pleased that this is a cross-party acceptance. So altogether, very good. But that doesn't mean to say that that's where we have to stop. And I want to concentrate for a moment on the issue of delivery, because in the end, what matters is delivery. And I am very concerned about delivery. And I want to go through some of the examples. I've just read the letter from the Secretary of State for Education to members of the House of Lords, explaining the skills bill that is coming before us. Climate change is not mentioned in that letter. There is no statement about the fact that we need to be training people for the green economy. There is no point in the letter unless that is the center of the new skills legislation, because it is the new economy for which we are training people. And I do think it is surprising that the Secretary of State for Education has not, as far as I know, made a speech about this at any time over the past year. And yet we can sign up to Paris, we can be running the COP26, we can be agreeing to net zero, we can be now signing up to the sixth carbon budget, and we don't have this. And the only parallel is the other area where it seems to me that there hasn't been the action which I would expect, and that is on planning. We've got a planning bill in front of Parliament, and again, we haven't faced up to the issue that if you're going to reach net zero, the planning has got to have the same demand that the Bank of England has. I mean, on what possible basis does the Treasury say to the Bank of England, reaching net zero is at the heart of our requirements of you, but we don't have it in the planning bill? And yet, unless the planning system is designed to take net zero, sustainability, the green future into account, we really aren't bringing the planning system up to date. And we have a very clear recent example of that. The Climate Change Committee is very clear about the distinction between our advice and our suggestions of the scenarios which would enable us to reach those targets, and the government's responsibility for deciding on precisely which of those they will do in order to reach the target. We set the targets, we judge the government against those targets. Our evidence would be taken into account in a court case were the government not to be reaching those targets. But it is not our job to say this is the right way and that's the right way. It is to present a range of ways which together will reach that end. But it doesn't mean to say that we have to allow the occasions pass when we have to point out that something is manifestly not in line with the targets. And that is why, in the most elegant way I could manage, we raised the question of the suggestion that we might have a new coal mine, which, apart from the fact that it was the wrong signal to be giving in any case, actually was based upon a fallacy. It was based upon the argument that we needed this coal for steel production, that we imported it from America at the moment, so it'd be better environmentally to produce it ourselves. That ignored the fact that the coal mine was going to export 80% of its coal, and that after the mid-2030s, it's not going to be possible to use coal unabated for even steel production. And that's very clear in the targets that we've already got. It's also true that the planning permission was given to the coal mine for a period up to 2047, which seemed to us to be not right. I mean, just not right to do that, given the background of climate change. But it was then clear that there's nothing in the planning acts to enable, in this case, the Cumbrian Council to make decisions other than the decision they were making. And that means that we have a very present example of the planning system not being up to date. And yet we have a bill proposed in the Queen's Speech which doesn't include that either. I use those two examples because no doubt by amendment and by the government changing its views in one way or another, we will get these right. But I'm raising it because the truth is that delivery is much more difficult than accepting targets and realizing what the threat is. In the end, delivery means you actually have to do these things. And I'm very concerned that we are not moving fast enough on delivery. I will give one other example. We have 1 million homes which have got to be retrofitted because the then government in 2017 stopped the movement to net zero homes. It was a terrible mistake because every one of those house owners bought a house which they actually carried with it a bill that they're going to have to pay. Whereas if we had introduced that act, then the house builders would have had to have built houses which didn't need retrofitting. And the cost would not have been higher, partly because the cost of doing it is so much lower if it is a mass production cost, and partly too because the cost would have been taken out of the cost of the land. We know that that's what happens when you buy houses. The price of house is fixed at the level that the house builder thinks he can get, and all the prices back from that are then fixed in accordance with it. And because of the huge difference between the value of land for agriculture and the value of land for development, it's quite clear, therefore, that you can take that value out of the land price, and therefore better housing arrangements are bound actually not to mean higher prices, although I'm afraid the house builders always claim it will. But they've always done that. They did that when I was Secretary of State 25 or more years ago. It hasn't changed. That is always the excuse for not doing what we need to do. But what it means is that the house builder passes the cost on to the buyer. And that seems to me to be unacceptable and electorally, in the end, really damaging. And yet we still haven't got to the point at which we know that by 2025, we really are going to get absolutely back to where we ought to be. And indeed, the government did go back on its promise that it was going to be 2024. They rewrote the announcement, a rather curious thing to have happened. At some point, somebody got in there. And I think it's really important that we, all of us, now talk primarily about delivery. And I'm hoping now over this next month, before we produce, and this is my last point, we produce our annual report. As you know, the Climate Change Committee is bound by law to produce an annual report on how well the government has been in reaching the targets. And we have to do that by the end of June. And we are working on it. It's moving towards completion now. And we're going to do it again this year in the way which we did it last year, which was to report not only on the government as a whole, but on each department one by one, so that we can really bring home where it is that the government needs to step up on delivery. And my big point here is very simple. All governments are bad on delivery. I could be just as critical of Labour governments and of coalition governments, so the fact that we have a Conservative government doesn't mean I'm attacking them alone. But the truth is, governments find delivery difficult. And we need, in fact, therefore, to keep the pressure up to get delivery rather than statements. And indeed, that 1917 cancellation was itself the result of another bit of political thinking. Because the previous government, the Labour government that's put that in place, did so perfectly knowing that it was a good deal ahead, so they didn't have to do much about it at that point. So both were guilty of that particular decision. I still think that we've really got to get this right, and delivery has got to be our key point. And that leads me to say how pleased I am that Polly is with us, because we aren't going to get that delivery unless the government builds a really good relationship with local authorities. Because, Bim, if I may say so, you know that most of this stuff can only be done locally. You can't do it from the centre. You have to make sure that this really works locally. And therefore, we've really got to try to get a very, very concerted effort, not just that every ministry has to realise that it's got a part to play, and that education is just as important as Department Bays, but also that the central government recognises that the national governments, the regional assemblies, the local governments, all of them are crucial in delivery. So I have to say the last 18 months of my chairmanship are going to be totally, well, not quite totally, but almost totally on delivery, because we have got to show that we are going to deliver if we don't find ourselves accused of hypocrisy and hollow promises.
Lord Deben, thank you, and sorry everybody for being tardy. Before we move on to Polly to talk about local government, John, if I could just ask you a couple of questions on your remarks that I thought were very interesting and perceptive. I've really got two questions. The first is about your point around delivery and the relationship, frankly, between central and local government or regional government. Is it your view that perhaps one of the changes of approach that we need is to mandate certain things, yes, at national level, and we've got the big macro targets that we all know about, but to have targets binding targets, whether it be statutory or otherwise, at local level, thereby helping that process of delivery at local level, which not just on climate change, but across all policy areas, and you know, because you've been in politics for a very long time, has been a long-running problem and difficulty. Is that a way of perhaps shifting that culture more aggressively in the direction that we need it to go?
Well, I think it is, Bim, and I have to say this is a problem which all ministers find when they get into the job, because I'm afraid civil servants at the centre always advise you not to do this too far because they don't really trust the local authority. It's quite interesting. They always say, better not, Minister. I think we ought to keep that power. And of course, that's not what we should do. I mean, you have to give power and responsibility to people if they're going to act. And as we now have a local government system in which there are some really valuable examples, I mean, the mayoral examples are really interesting, because where the mayors really showed that they were leading, of both major political parties, they won. Where they didn't win. It's really quite interesting that this is a real exercise in democracy and didn't fit the national swing at all. When you look at Manchester and you look at Teesside, you look at Cambridge and you look at West Midlands, you see what happens. It happens that this is, we've got a vibrancy in local government now, which is, I think, really worthwhile picking up. So I agree with you. It should not just be on climate change. I think it should be on the whole range of sustainability, as a matter of fact. But it's not so much targets, because they're rather good on the targets. Most local authorities have got good targets. It's that there's no help. I mean, I've asked the question. I haven't got an answer from it, because I know what the answer is. You should never ask questions you haven't got the answer to. So I've asked the question of the MHCLG. I've said, what advice could Cumbria call upon on environmental matters? Indeed, what advice have you got internally on these issues? Now, local authorities, many of them have been actually reinventing the wheel, because they've felt that they've had to go for advice on exactly the same thing that their neighbouring local authorities be. So the first thing that we should be doing is not only giving them the power, not only giving them the responsibility, but also having much more central advice and much less central control. Those seems to me to be the mix that we need.
Yeah, and just my second question, going back to something you said near the beginning of your remarks, which is about the coal mine. And I'm just interested in your view on the difficulties, and this is something that has increasingly come up, and I've had lots of discussions with ministers about it, about how we are going to find and use the metals, steel and rarer metals, in order to achieve our environmental objectives, whether it be on wind farms, solar panels, all the rest of it. I'm just interested in what your view of this is, because there is a view creeping in not just in Britain, but when I speak to politicians in Canada and Australia and the rest, which is, well, if we don't do some of this dirty stuff, it still needs to get done, because that's the stuff that makes the electric cars or the wind turbine. And all we're doing is we're shifting that, or rather putting that in China or parts of sub-Saharan Africa or wherever it is. How do you respond to that criticism? Because I think it's one that I'm increasingly sort of hearing, and in particular from certain colleagues from parts of the country where I think they've had they're looking for more manufacturing. They will often say, well, let us do it. We can do it at high standard. We can do it in a clean as possible way. We'll innovate. But if we just say we're not going to do it, then that will go to parts of the world and countries where their standards are less high.
Well, first of all, in the Climate Change Committee, we are very, very hot on this, and we look very carefully at all the time about whether the policies result in offshoring, because in any case, it's a destructive concept. Because I mean, there's no point in getting rid of, in reducing your emissions here if you increase the emissions somewhere else. So let's be absolutely clear, it's central to the way that we think about things. The second thing is that it's not that we think that we're not going to make steel. It is that we've got to say that between now and then, we've got to find a way of using hydrogen, let's say, in order to make that steel. In other words, we've got to, or we have to use coal with carbon capture and storage. The argument about this particular coal mine is that 80% of the coal was not going to be used in Britain anyway, so it would be exported. And frankly, what it would mean would be that our emissions would go up because we'd have to account for that coal, and it would not necessarily be going to countries or installations which were meeting the same environmental standards that we do. So you'd be actually undermining your own industry if you did that. So the argument for the coal mine is, but there is a point here which I hope when you will press with ministers, you really have to recognize that if environmental policies are particularly onerous on a part of the country, then it's the government's job to replace the jobs which would have been produced by, in this case, the coal mine. Levelling up means also that with the green jobs, there are many of them where the government has a mechanism for putting the jobs in places where, or helping to get the jobs in places which would otherwise suffer from the transition. And we need a just transition, not just between people, but between areas. So if you take this case, I mean, I do have to ask, and I declare an interest because I live in Suffolk, but I just have to ask, if we're going to build nuclear power stations, and I'm in favour of nuclear power, we should be building them in places where there is high unemployment. We shouldn't be building them in places where there isn't high unemployment. And I would have thought, if I had been the Secretary of State, these circumstances, I think what I would have tried to do would be to say the next nuclear power station is going to go to Cumbria. And then we'll get some of the jobs which will have been lost because we're not going to have the coal mine. Now, I realize there are drawbacks and difficulties, but the fact of the matter is we're going to pay for the nuclear power station. We know perfectly well that this is a transition system which we have to have for a period of time in order to keep the lights on. But in the end, it's the customer and the government on behalf of the customer that's going to pay for it. So we ought to have a whip hand. I use that as one example. It may be impossible and it's not for me to make that decision, but I still think that we just have to recognize that a just transition has to be geographically just as well as personally just. So it's not just about looking after the poorest. It's not just about looking after the disadvantaged in terms of people. It's also about parts of the country.
Thank you. Holly, fire away. What are your thoughts? And then we'll go on to questions.
Thanks very much, Bim, and I'm delighted to be here. It's really exciting to have the opportunity to talk to PRASEG members about our piece of research, which I'll just put. Can I put it in the chat? Is that the best place to put it, or should I put it in Q&A so everybody can see it? Where's the best place to share the link so that everybody can see the work? Anyway, I'll keep talking and then someone can help me with that in a minute. It's really lovely to hear from Lord Deben, and particularly some of the things he was saying about targets. We've got loads of our members who've made commitments. We are now talking about demonstration and delivery, but when we see that the Climate Change Act has said that the current commitments by the government do not yet measure up to the size to meet the size of the net zero challenge, when the National Audit Office's own reports indicate that there are big gaps in what is needed to happen, we know that there is ultimately a gap between anything that national government does and meeting net zero, which needs to be filled with local action. Predominantly, I'm sure many of the people on this call will know and understand, that's because two of the things we've really got to decarbonise, heating buildings and transport happen in places. Now, I'm delighted to hear the Prime Minister talk about the wonderful transformation of our energy system through offshore wind. As somebody who was a special advisor when the Department for Energy and Climate Change was established, I'm delighted to see that there's become a cross-party consensus over the last 10 years about intervening in that market to shape it and create it and make sure that offshore wind prices are tumbling, and therefore that we've got cheaper renewable energy. What I'm really keen to make sure that everybody understands is that doesn't happen by magic. It happens by government intervention, and we cannot rely simply on those big levers of Whitehall, as Lord Deben has pointed out, in order to be able to decarbonise the whole economy. It needs to happen in places. And one of the things that we've learned, particularly from the COVID crisis, is how important local government is on delivery, especially if they are key partners in designing the way that those things happen, because they have a granular knowledge of their own communities. I use as an example the fact that at some point when they were creating the delivery parcels for food for people who were shielding, at some point they ended up with 5-litre bottles of orange squash. Now, I don't know about you, I'm a pretty healthy middle-aged woman. I know that women in their 70s or 80s might struggle to use a 5-litre bottle of orange squash, and it was the local authorities that said, no, do you know what, we're going to dilute that, we're going to decant that before we hand it over to our residents. Those kind of micro decisions are actually what needs to happen when we're talking about transforming our communities at local level, because people know and understand their communities. But at the moment, what we find is that even though there is a general presumption of competence, which is outlined in our report, and many other pieces of legislation that presume towards making decisions at local level, many national barriers get in the way. And that ends up with us celebrating the innovation of our members, but we have to celebrate them, but even though that diverts us from the reality, which is that there is an absence of coherent national strategy or framework to enable and resource ambitious local action on climate change. So we're suggesting there needs to be an overall framework. Ultimately, I think that probably is going to need to have some kind of legislative wrapper, a sort of local net zero powers bill that would be very complementary to the Climate Change Act that established the Committee on Climate Change, because that budgetary approach, which was established with that legislation, is great for a national approach. Now we need to be starting to understand what it is that enables that to deliver in reality. I've just picked up the report, which I have to say is a weighty tome in over 100 pages, and is one of those ones where if you are not used to looking at policy that applies to local government, can feel a little bit overwhelming. But simply in the buildings and homes section, we have the number of different pieces of legislation that are potentially there to be able to help local authorities tackle decarbonisation of homes, but are still failing to enable them to do it properly. The minimum energy efficiency standards, EPCs, and energy performance certificates, the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, the Homes Fit for Human Habitation Act 2018, the Decent Home Standards 2000, the Eco obligation, the Green Homes Grant, the local authority delivery element of which was actually fantastically successful and should be built on rather than scrapped, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. And if I was simply to go to the Home Energy Conservation Act, which requires all local authorities in England to submit reports annually to the Secretary of State, setting out the measures they've adopted to improve the energy efficiency of residential accommodation within their areas, there is no obligation to take any action, no feedback from central government, such as a summary of findings or sharing of information, no enforcement even of the need to report. So in practice, local authorities are not actually using that in a way that really could transform things. If we want to take this seriously, we could spend all of our time tinkering on every single piece of legislation, but I know I would be dead before we got that done, and we need to be able to achieve net zero by 2050. So I'm suggesting there needs some heavy lifting and legislative framework to be created so that it's not just on homes, but on transport, on energy, on waste, on powers, on finance. Those things are transformed. Lord Deben mentioned the planning bill that's coming up. That is absolutely crucial to being able to transform this. We think that if there was one thing that could be done to be able to make this really transform is making sure that the Climate Change Act is the planning policy is has to meet the Climate Change Act and embed that as a requirement in any changes that go forward. Simply starting to look at that means that we can change the way that currently those potential powers are limited by national frameworks. I'm very happy to take further questions, and I'd be very also happy to share the document link in the chat so that people can read it in more detail. Thank you, Bim.
Well, thank you, Polly, and I'm sure you won't be dead before we sort this out, or at least I hope.
I hope not.
We are joined by some of my colleagues, Alan Brown, Lord Cameron, Philip, and Philip Dunne. I'm going to just put them on the spot, and if any of them want to jump in and see if they want to ask a question rather than me hog it for longer, which I'm perfectly happy to do if they don't want to ask a question. Alan?
Thanks, Bim. Thanks for putting me in the spot. What was going through my mind there with Lord Deben, with your opening remarks, then what Polly was saying at the end, is so everybody seems agreed that local delivery is going to be important and giving powers to local authorities, but as part of the issue, we're still waiting on an overall net zero strategy. So you need the net zero strategy, somebody having absolute leadership in delivering that within the government, and then the associated powers, but importantly, obviously funding or funding leverage allocated, because powers in itself, when local authorities are getting their budgets cut, the devolved administrations, like the Scottish Government has had a capital budget cut. So actually, it's not just powers and targets, but it needs that overall leadership and strategy, but importantly, funding. So how does that get addressed in the short term?
Well, that's a very difficult question, Alan. So you naturally give, but the first thing you have to do, it seems to me, is to recognise what Polly said, that local authorities have the granular understanding of what you have to do locally, and no one else can do that. And therefore, the first thing we have to get is a real feeling from MHCLG that they understand that, and that there is a real partnership between them and local authority. I don't get that feeling at the moment, and I really think there's got to be a very significant effort from the centre to reach out so that there is the kind of consultation and understanding through which they can see what resources are necessary. And I think one of the problems is that at the moment it's a kind of it's a very wrong bidding process. The local authority says we need this, government says you don't need that. Actually, if you work on this together, it'll become clear to government what it is that is necessary and what it is that government doesn't need to do and that local authorities can do. So I really think that the change of attitude, which should be immediate, I mean, it's a question of saying we are now going to behave in a different way from the way that we've done before. And this means real ministerial leadership, because as I said, one of the problems is not the ministers wanting to do this, but it is that the civil service at the centre are always leery of allowing localities to have the sort of confidence and resources and role which I think they need.
Thanks.
Thank you. Philip Dunne from Ludlow.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Bim, and for giving me the chance to pose a question. I'm sorry I missed the opening remarks from Lord Deben, which I'm sure were characteristically informative. I mean, just picking up this question of local engagement and how do we encourage local communities led by their local authorities to start taking action. I'd just like to use this opportunity to promote something which my local community has put together, literally hot off the press this week ahead of a conference on Saturday. This is the South Shropshire Climate Action Plan, put together by a well-informed group of local activists, but with the close cooperation of Shropshire Council, the local authority here, which is one of the many local authorities which have declared a climate emergency and are looking to see what that means and how that should influence their policies across the piece in the future. And I think the question that was just asked and the response that we've just had on Polly's remarks that I did catch illustrate the need as the government seeks to develop a path to net zero, which encompasses government policy across departments, because as we all know, the environment does not respect administrative boundaries, that they have to start providing the tools to allow local authorities to play their part. And it's not just about funding, although that is clearly important, as Alan was saying, but it's also about what is it that if you've got a national policy, for example, to decarbonise homes, how do you translate that down into the local authority owned council houses or the housing association run or owned affordable housing, social housing, as well as owner occupiers? It requires a coordinated response. And the committee that I chair, the Environmental Audit Committee, is looking sort of post COP26 to set up a scrutiny framework as to how we bring government action to bear to deliver on the carbon budgets and the government policies. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that some local areas and communities are starting to try and put their thoughts into action plans, but how do we deliver these? And I don't know whether Lord Deben has anything else he'd like to add about how he can make this happen, but we're keen as our committee to try and play our part.
Well, Philip, thank you very much for that. I have to say to you that we are celebrating the lesser lockdown by having a little holiday in Shropshire. So I'm very pleased that you should have raised a local example of that sort. I mean, I think we have to say that local authorities and local action groups are doing a vast amount. So I'm not at all sure that this is a matter of the government trying to get them to do it. It's about the government enabling them to do the things that they want to do in any case. They have done some work in this, which is very good. There are some a series of areas where the local university, the local authority and the community as a whole are working together on, in effect, a local version of the Climate Change Committee, the Climate Change Commissions in Leeds, in Edinburgh, in Belfast, which is an amazing thing. I mean, Belfast with a Sinn Féin run local authority and a real effort to working together. It's one of those things that brings the communities together. And also in Bristol, those are supported by the government, but that's spread out now. And we have a very good operation going in Bristol, Cambridge, a whole series of places now around the country. And I do recommend, and in Shropshire, it's perfectly possible, the local universities, I mean, you have, for example, you have Harper Adams in Shropshire. Harper Adams is working very hard. I'm hoping to visit them next week to look at what they're doing on land use. It's going to be a crucial part of reaching net zero. I'm afraid my wife is once again being taken to things on the basis that we're on holiday, but I would like to see what's going on. So we're going to Harper Adams, I hope, to have a look at their very exciting new programme. Now, to link that in with the Shropshire County Council, to link that in too with the voluntary organisations, we've been talking to the Bishop of Shrewsbury, the Catholic Diocese of Shrewsbury, because the Catholic Diocese are working on how they put all this into operation because of Laudato Si, the Pope's encyclical. The Anglicans have also got a system of this kind, and we're trying to bring all that together because we need everybody, but the local authority is the key player. And the relationship between government and the local authority, I think, is much less the government getting the local authorities to do things. It's the government cooperating with the local authorities, making sure that they have the ability to do things. And as you say, Philip, it's not just resources, not just money, it's actually information. Why on earth we're trying to invent the wheel in every part of the country when much of this can be shared? It's the government helping with its forward plans and working with the local authorities so those forward plans are actually cooperative plans and not pushed from the top downwards. And also this very simple matter, which I really feel strongly about, government giving local authorities the feeling that they want to be partners. At the moment, that feeling is not there, and we need to get that feeling. And I think if we get it, we'll have a real response from local authorities all over the country.
And Bim, is it all right for me to come in there? That'd be great. Philip, I totally agree with you. There is so much innovation going on, and we celebrate that through our network of making sure that the innovation that is there is shared between our members. And that's fantastic what is happening in Ludlow and Shropshire. What we find, however, is that these innovations have to be celebrated because they're exceptional and they're working against the national and regulatory frameworks that are limiting their ability to do things. So we want to make sure that local authorities can do as much as they can within the current framework and test out the limits of those barriers, identify where those barriers are, and then say to national government, you want to reach net zero by 2050? We want to reach net zero by 2045. We can't do that unless you change the rules. Highways England has no obligation to tackle air pollution on any roads other than their own, and therefore they don't cooperate with local authorities on air pollution programmes. Ofgem has no real obligation at the moment to have proper engagement with local area energy planning with local authorities. The knowledge and know-how that is required in order to be able to engage with the distribution network operators is not there, and no one's bothering to tell them how to do it. They're crucial for those kind of things. We've got National Planning Inspectorate, which goes around ripping out more ambitious sustainability standards in new homes when local authorities want to do them, saying that it's a drag on the market. These are material examples of how national frameworks are militating against us getting to net zero when local authorities want to be able to do stuff. And that's where we can really make a change. So I think a legislative wrapper that goes around it is really important. Can I also point out that a former Labour MHCLG minister said to me, local authorities say they want more powers and resources, and quite often they're very happy to just take the resources. So I'm making this a difference, right? We are not as a network going to be bought off by more cash. I know there's not necessarily loads available. We do need more powers. We need permission, obligation and enabling powers in order to be able to meet net zero. And every single piece of legislation in this Queen's speech and many others up until 2030 need to be considering that. Otherwise, we will not reach the targets that are within those carbon budgets.
I'm going to come in and apply a corrective because I think it's important. Everybody always says they're in favour of devolution, more power to the people, more power for local communities. You don't get politicians ever saying, no, more power for me, less for you. I mean, that's just, yeah. So everybody always says this. The tough political question, however, is this. I think one of the obstacles, and I've been listening to what people have been saying, and I always get worried when there's too much common sense, which means, therefore, there's a reason why this hasn't happened. And I think that the reason is probably twofold. And I'd be very interested, Lord Deben, with your experience in the cabinet and as an MP and all the rest of it, as your sense of this. But now speaking freely, of course. One is that with more powers, with or without more cash, but with more powers, then they can end up being used in areas that are not strictly used with to do with the climate. And climate change, etc., and end up causing the government a pain in other ways. And the second is that information is really important. I think the point you make about having best practice, I mean, that really should be done. I'm actually quite surprised that isn't done already. Information is one thing, and I don't think anybody will ever oppose that. But isn't the truth that this issue is becoming so politically salient that if the central government were to effectively the central government's going to be held responsible. I fully expect at the next election for people to get up at hustings and say to me, "Ben, what's the government, how is Britain performing in these targets?" And if the answer is, well, it's okay, or it's not very good, if I say no, but that was because Cumbria County Council didn't do X or Y, I'm afraid that isn't going to wash. So I'm just interested as to your view as to why eminent breakout of common sense isn't actually happening at the moment.
Well, I went through, as a minister, the battle between local authorities and the government when local authorities decided that they were going to be the opposition. And you had the Derek Hattons of this world, which I think very much damaged the relationship. And I was also a minister when we began to try to get the then governments to recognise that local authorities had changed, and that if you wanted them to go on changing, that you really had to build a relationship. I think there's a fundamental issue, Ben, which is simply that we are a very centralised nation, and we've never been very happy about this. This is not something that we've really built on. But I don't believe we live in a society any longer where you can have top-down operations. I just don't think that's what's happened. And we've got to find a way of doing it. I agree with you that it's difficult because people always blame the government for whatever the local authorities, but I'm afraid the government's going to have to learn to deal with that. I mean, I think it's no good just saying that happens. What we have to do is to learn to find a different way of relating with the local authorities. And I repeat the point that I said, but Philip didn't hear. But I mean, if you look at the mayoral elections, they did not run according to the national swing. The mayors that had shown that they really did run the local area with real strength won, and those that didn't. So, the Conservatives lost 2 mayoral elections that they would have been expected, given the general run of things, to have won, and they held on in remarkable ways, as did the Labour Party in Manchester, for example, where Andy Burnham has shown absolutely the kind of leadership that you need. Now, if you say that, then it seems to me relationships there, and I myself would start off with those particular authorities who have got the powers and the abilities, and help them, learn from them, and help them. And it's a two-way system, and we're very bad at the two-way system. We have to learn from them. I want to learn from Andy Burnham. I want to learn from Andy Street. I want to learn from Ben Houchin. And I want to do that at the same time, trying to help them do what they want to do. And I know there will be a response. I've been very close to the West Midlands Authority. The new chief executive of Birmingham, who was doing the West Midlands Authority, is very much involved in this. There's a great number of local authorities with whom the government could build a new relationship, but you have to do it in a way which both sides take responsibility for the decisions they make. And local authorities have got to be better at not blaming the government when it really is their fault. But it's always true that you blame the body above you and demand subsidiarity from the body above you. That is one of the facts of life. We've just got to learn to live with it, Bim. And I very much appreciate the way you've assessed that, because it is true, absolutely. But I just think the world has changed. We don't live in a world in which direction from above, authority, has the same kind of ring that it once had.
Thank you. I think that's really, really interesting and very thoughtful. We've got 4 minutes left. Polly, if I might ask you, and actually Alan Brown as well, almost from an SNP and a Scottish government perspective, though obviously I know you're a Westminster Member of Parliament. And this is a tough question. I don't mean this to be overly political. Do you think that there is a danger that the difficult relationship, if we put it that way, between the Scottish government and Westminster puts any of these workings at risk in relation to what we're talking about here? I'm not talking about other things, but in relation to the climate. Because it's my view that what is really difficult, and obviously, Alan, you know I'm a unionist, right, and that's fine, but it's my view that what I have observed is that when you have such a difficult political relationship between a very significant part of the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom government in Westminster, it really affects everything. And I'm just interested as to, on the climate issue, what your assessment is on the relationships and whether you think that that will cause a problem. And Polly, your view from almost an outside perspective, but as somebody who's obviously very plugged in and knows what's going on.
I'm more than happy to let Paula go first, and then I'll give you my thoughts.
Thanks, Alan. I totally agree with you, Bim. I think one of the downsides of what's happened through COVID, which has sort of exacerbated some of the sort of tricky relationships between local government in England in particular with Whitehall and Westminster, have got worse because of that failure to understand what local government can do. Now, actually, I know that a lot of ministers have been councillors, so I don't actually think it's necessarily the political class, dare I say it, as the Secretariat, who have the only experience that most senior civil servants have got with their local authorities is complaining about the Billington paying their council tax, possibly, right? And they don't, and the sort of the de haut en bas of Whitehall, it can be quite severe. I think there needs to be some strengthening of MHCLG, and I think what's interesting is that I keep banging on about the fact that you can't negotiate with the science. Politics is all about negotiation. It's all about like shaving off the corners and finding a way through and all that kind of thing. And it freaks out politicians because you can't negotiate with the science, right? But that means they have to negotiate with everybody else, right? And that means finding common cause with people that you normally don't, that you normally find dividing lines on or whatever. And I've seen this, for example, with the way that the opposition and some NGOs have been expressing their concerns about the UK Infrastructure Bank. I'm not bothered about the size of it, to be honest. It's not about the size, chaps. It's all about what you do with it. Design it right, and then you can build and capitalize it bigger over time. And that kind of, oh, it's not big enough, is really the kind of dividing line that instead we need to be sort of saying, great, you've got an infrastructure bank. Right, now we're going to roll up our sleeves and help you design it right, because otherwise it's going to go off in the wrong direction no matter how much money it's got. And I think there is an opportunity for that kind of a political consensus, but it requires an understanding, for, like Lord Deben has pointed out, as to the opportunity and power that there is in local government. And the key thing about local government, and you know this, Bim, as a constituency MP, is that the closer you are to the people who elect you, the more authority you have and the more ability you have to bring people together across dividing lines. And that's what local authorities can do if they feel that they've got the confidence of national government to be able to deliver.
Alan, any thoughts, final thoughts? We're about to finish.
Yeah, I mean, I know the point you're making. There's going to be constitutional wranglings, let's not be kidded, between the SNP and, well, we could say the Greens in Scotland as well, because we want a referendum. But that doesn't stop. I think the key point Paula made was finding common cause. So it doesn't stop finding common cause. Now, the Scottish Government declared a climate emergency. The Scottish Government's got some strategies in place that the UK Government don't have in place. So it's that common cause and working together. And actually, what you see sometimes, and it depends on different ministers as well, to be honest. So it's not a one size fits all, because some of the post-Brexit bills that have been going through Westminster, Scottish Government in many cases provided a legislative consent motion. UK ministers agreed to change bills following representations made to the devolved administrations, but some other ministers chose not to. So it's developing the relationships and between individual ministers as well, and find that common cause and work together. And given how serious climate emergency is, I think you can rest assured that, you know, that's where kind of political spats go out the window, where you can actually find ways to work together.
Could I say one thing, Bim? Yeah. Could I just say one thing? We advise the Scottish Government separately, as we do the Welsh Government. And one of the things that is very notable is that we are able to do so with very considerable strength. And Scotland is doing better than the United Kingdom as a whole in other areas, as is Wales. Wales does better on waste than anybody, including Scotland. And Scotland is doing really very well in a number of areas. one of the things I think we really got to get used to is not ever scoring points when it comes to the issue of climate change, because we're not going to deliver what we have to deliver if we allow party politics to come into it. We are very fortunate that we have a consensus, and we really should be very careful about breaking that consensus. I'm very tough when people try to take credit for these things as against some other political party. The party, we should, of course, the opposition's job is to make the government do more quickly. That's its job. But it should be doing it in a way which is consensual. And the same is true as far as the relationship between England and the rest of the United Kingdom in each of the nationalities. We really do have to recognise that we can have a disagreement about independence, for example, but that doesn't mean to say that, as Alan says, it doesn't mean to say that we can't operate as we have to operate, and as we'll have to operate whatever happens, on the basis that we all have to reach net zero. And that is why I'm always displeased when either side use this issue to say that you're getting it wrong and we would do it in a... That's not the way we do it. This is a really important consensual issue. And I'm delighted that we have very good relationships with the Scottish Nationalist Party in Scotland in the work that we do. And I have every intention of maintaining that.
Great. We have consensus from the SNP, Conservatives, Sinn Féin in Belfast even, ladies and gentlemen. I want to say thank you for joining. I know I've learned a lot. I hope you have. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for Polly. Thank you to Lord Deben, Alan Brown, Philip Dunne. If the parliamentarians would stay on whilst we just tidy up the AGM for PRASEG, I would be eternally grateful. And, you know, I've just thought of JFK's speech to the American University in 1963, where he said something along the lines of, you know, we all have a shared humanity, we all live on this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. So I think that they are words that we should all bear in mind. Thank you everybody for joining.